the zcam E2-F6. I sold my E2 so I could buy this camera, so it's now my A camera, and I've played with other cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, the 6K, the Panasonic S1H, and they're all great cameras, but I just prefer what zcam is doing. A lot of it has to do with the form factor, the company themselves, and what they're giving me with this camera as far as frame rates and resolutions and features. I'll show off the pretty footage and then I'll get into the technical stuff. I managed to find some new places to shoot to get some footage to show off. I went to Duncan Gardens at Manitou Park in Spokane, and then to Green Bluff, which is just north of Spokane. It's a small farmer community, apples, peaches, pumpkins, animals, that kind of stuff. I wasn't sure if I should grade in a more technical manner or maybe give it a more cinematic feel. So some of these shots are a little more technical, and then some of the shots are more artistic or cinematic, whatever that means. I guess that means smoother roll off, just a different grading style. I also threw on my Ivoscope anamorphic adapter, so there are some anamorphic shots in there you'll see with the black bars on the top and bottom. I know that's a lot of flair. It's the fun part of playing with old lenses. They have some interesting character. Modern lenses are so boring in that regard. If they have flair, it's just not very fun. Especially the anamorphic lens has that orange streaks, vertical and horizontal streaks. It's fun to play with. I don't have a lot of opportunity to play with that lens, so when I can get outside and have the sun set like that, I'll point the lens right at that sun, get all that flare. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit about some of these clips. For the most part, I was really happy with the way they turned out. I was using my EVF for pulling focus. I was entirely handheld, that's why it's so shaky. I don't even own a gimbal anymore. The EVF really helps me get the focus, although I think one of the lenses I had wasn't hitting infinity focus, so when I pulled that shot of the mountain wasn't sharp, it wasn't fully in focus. I did notice some noise in a couple shots, which kind of surprised me. Now, remember, these shots were taken with the pre-production unit. I only just recently got the production unit, so that could account for some things. I remember when I got the E2 a year ago, at first, some of the images at 4K 120 didn't look very good, and in about a month or two after that, it improved quite a bit just through firmware updates. So if there's anything less than great image-wise right now, it'll probably improve with some firmware updates. I've pulled in some footage I shot in September with the F6, the pre-production unit, and I'm going to show you how I edited this footage and then compare it to the E2 that was shot in a similar lighting situation. And we'll see how I think the F6 is much improved in terms of low light performance, noise, and dynamic range. I've turned off all of the grading so we can see what the shot looked like originally. Now, I happen to have my anamorphic adapter on when I shot this. Why? I don't know. It was on there and I thought, well, we'll just see what it does. I was also at a 2.4:1 ratio so I could get 6K 60 frames per second. So that's why this is super, super stretched. Now, I ended up cropping in so that it wasn't so crazy widescreen. Probably wasn't a great choice to shoot anamorphic in this particular setup, but I was just playing around. Let me show you what I have going on with my grade. The first thing I'm going to do is show you that I don't have anything clipped in this shot. If I pull down the highlights here and zoom in over here on the waveform, you'll see that none of these peaks are clipped. They have definition, they have detail. So I'm just going to delete this one. The first thing I did was put some noise reduction on. Now it's very subtle because it's only set to 4. So you're not going to see very much. I'd have to zoom in on something dark like this to even see. If I turn it off, you'll see that there's a bit of grain and then it gets smoother. I'm going to leave it off for now because it tends to slow down processing on this computer. So I can show you everything else. The next thing I did was pull the blacks in. I shot this in a log profile, so it was very flat. So since I'm doing an entirely manual grade here, I pulled the blacks down with the curves. And I'm also pulling in those highlights just to wrangle them from the start. The reason why I'm using parallel nodes here is I'm using a lot of qualifiers. So I'm keying in on colors and certain luminance ranges. And I don't want a previous node to influence the next node. So if I had these all in series, anything I did beforehand would affect the qualifier on the next node. And that's not a very good thing to deal with. So by going with parallel nodes, I can make changes. I can make qualifiers on all of these. And I'm not going to be affected by other nodes, except for this one, which I'm not going to change. It's just noise reduction anyway. This node called screen is this TV screen behind my subjects. If I go to my power window, you'll see that I've put a couple of boxes around here. The first one here is hooked onto the TV. If I hit play, you'll see that it's following, it's tracking that screen. And I'm just using that to bring down the luminance. But then I had to mask out my subjects so that I don't affect the luminance on them. So I have 3 power windows here. And if I turn on this mode, you can see that it's only affecting the bright parts of the image. My third node here called top is this video game screen. You'll see that I've placed some trackers, and again, it's going to hug this top bright section here, and I can bring it down using the curves just to bring that brightness down a little bit. And again, it's only affecting the bright part of the image. My fourth parallel node called right bright, you'll see if I turn this on here, I'm just bringing down the brightness of the arcade machines over here on the right hand side. And again, I believe I am tracking, it's not moving very much, but it does track the position of these machines. Now I'm not bringing down the brightness of the people walking in front because I've used a qualifier. It's only keying on the bright parts, which does not include these people. So let me turn that on. If I do this, you'll see that it's only seeing the very, very bright machine. My fifth node, called blue LEDs, are these lights right here around the TV screen. If I click my power windows here, you'll see that I've masked off just those blue LEDs. And again, I've used my qualifier so that I'm highlighting just the bright blue LEDs. And I use the curves to bring down the brightness. Bringing it down with the curve does a really nice natural brightness reduction. If you try to grab something up here where it's very bright on the curve, it's going to look unnatural. It's going to start to turn a kind of a grayish color, and it doesn't look good. This node called toy is this arcade machine over here. It looks like a toy. I think it's actually a seat. Again, I've masked it and I've reduced the brightness of it. This node called lights left is obviously the left side over here, all these bright lights. Once again, I've qualified them, keyed them, and tracked them so that I'm bringing down just these bright highlights. As you can see, the performance is starting to slow down. I'm only at 24 frames, so it's actually doing okay. But with this many nodes all doing qualifiers and tracking and luminance adjustments, it starts to use a bit more processing power and it starts to slow down. There we go, 10 frames. Up until now, I've been grading on a relatively flat image. I did just a little bit of contrast with this node. Otherwise, it's that flat profile look of Zlog2. In this node, I introduced some contrast. So basically, I just pulled down some shadows, pushed up the highlights a little bit here, and just to give my image a little bit more contrast. Now, this isn't the actual grade that I have in my video if you look on YouTube, because I graded in HDR, and that's an entirely different workflow. I can't really do the same thing here because I'm just in standard dynamic range in this video. In this node here, I have a plugin called Dead Pixel Fixer. This pre-production camera had quite a few dead pixels, so you can see I've put a little check mark on them, and the plugin will automatically replace those little dead pixels. What they look like here, if I zoom in, let me hit stop and bypass that node, is just a little white speck. It's like a 1 pixel white. That's why they call it a hot pixel sometimes. And all I have to do is put this little circle around it, and DaVinci Resolve will just erase that little speck for me. On this last node, I have just a little bit of sharpening. I found using the sharpening here under blur, pulling this down produces a good sharpening. There are some sharpening plugins over here, but they work a little differently, and I just don't like them as much. For two reasons. One, when I use noise reduction, that tends to soften the image a little bit, so I'm making up for that. And two, because I'm shooting through anamorphic glass, there's a natural softness added by that. I thought it was just a little bit too soft, so I just wanted to sharpen that image up a little bit. And when I do a split screen, you can see how I've controlled my highlights, and yet I was able to bring out the color and contrast in my subjects. It's not perfect, of course, but it's certainly better than where it started. For comparison with the E2, I have this scene, which was shot in a similar location. It's an arcade, it's dark. I will run you through my grading process for this one, but I think you'll see right away there's a difference in noise and dynamic range. First thing I want to do is zoom right in here and look at the noise, because I can see that there's a lot more noise in this shot. The lighting in this arcade was relatively the same as the other arcade, so I basically doubled the amount of noise reduction in this first node. I'll turn it on here and you can see it gets a lot smoother. I'll go in even closer. You can see like this. So that's without noise reduction, and that's with noise reduction. So it's taking out a lot of that noisy grain. Now I have to admit that this was taken at 4K 120 frames per second, which can be pretty noisy, especially in the dark areas. If you underexpose a little bit, it gets very grainy and very noisy. In this shot, if I had exposed to the right, I would have blown out some of these highlights. So I didn't do that, so I have a little more noise in the shadows than I would otherwise. For this video, I had to completely redo my grade on this scene. I had a grade in my HDR edit that did not work in this Rec 709 timeline. So I just cleared it all out and went straight to the zcam color plugin, which got me 90% there, maybe 95%. It looks really good just as it is right now. The blacks look good, the highlights are looking really good, they're fairly well controlled. I did keep this node from my other edit, which had just, again, it's pulling down just the highlights, and it's very subtle. If I bypass it, you'll see that it's just doing a little bit on these bright whites, bring them down just a little bit. And then I also added some sharpening at the end. Let me turn on the noise reduction. So if I zoom in like on our face, you can see it's a very subtle sharpening. It's not very strong at all. Let me bypass. So that's off. That's on. Just a little bit of sharpening. It's even hard to see it. Now side by side, the E2-F6 on the left, the E2 on the right, what I'm seeing is the F6 with its slightly wider dynamic range is giving us better results in both the highlights and the shadows. Overall, there's a lot less noise in the F6. You'd expect that from a larger sensor with larger pixels. There's going to be less noise, but that dynamic range gives us better blacks and whites. The E2 didn't clip any of the highlights. I didn't crush the blacks, but there's color noise in those blacks, and maybe there's not as much detail in those blacks, whereas I feel like I have everything I need in the F6. I think it's helpful to see a size comparison between full frame and micro four thirds. You can see that the full frame is quite a bit larger, and in fact it's 250% larger, meaning it gathers a lot more light and therefore has less noise. Even when you crop in, because each physical pixel is larger, it produces less noise than the smaller pixel that you have on the Micro Four Thirds sensor. Looking at all three sensors, you can really get the feel for how big the full frame sensor is compared to the other sensors. So how do they compare in terms of noise? This has to be the ultimate zcam noise test. So I have the E2 on the top, the S6 in the middle, and the F6 on the bottom. You can see the ISOs on screen. I've set the ISOs so that the white bar on the exposure card is at 80%. This is at a 1:1 pixel ratio, meaning I am not scaling anything at all. So this is what it looks like pixel to pixel. Obviously the F6, having larger pixels and a bigger sensor overall, has the best noise performance, and we can see it here. It has the least noise of all three. Interestingly, the S6 appears to have more noise than the E2, but remember, the F6 and S6 are 6K cameras. The E2 is only 4K, so when I scale the F6 and S6 down to 4K, it's going to reduce the size of that noise. So now that we're taking advantage of the full 6K resolution, we can see that the S6 has smaller noise than the E2, and I think it also has less noise overall than the E2. But the F6 is clearly the real winner here. It has the least amount of noise, although I think it does have some noise reduction. It looks like there's noise reduction on that image, maybe a bit too much, so maybe that's something zcam can dial back a little bit. It's still going to have less noise than the other two cameras. This is also a great opportunity to look at the difference in the field of view between these cameras. I have the same lens on each camera. It's a Canon FD that I've used before on my comparison videos, and we can see that the Micro Four Thirds sensor looks zoomed in because it has a smaller sensor. It's only seeing part of that image from the lens, whereas the S6 is a little wider, and the F6, of course, is a full frame sensor, so we're getting the full field of view from that lens. It's going to have the widest field of view. I'll zoom in the same amount from there so that you can see that noise a little closer. And then I'll zoom back out so we can see some skin tones here. I haven't graded any of these shots. This is just straight out of the camera, Z-Log 2. The E2-F6 comes with a couple of accessories. The antenna for the Wi-Fi and two power cables. This one is a LEMO 2-pin to a common D-tap. This is the one you'll most likely use if you're using a V-mount battery. It also includes an adapter that goes to a barrel connector so you can attach a common power supply. It has a basic warranty paper and a quick start guide, and of course the box, which is foam lined on the inside. I've been shooting with the E2-F6 since September, and up until now I've been using this pre-production unit, which it's relatively similar to this, but there are some physical changes on the outside. The buttons are on the left side, just like in the E2-S6. Oh, and by the way, all of the changes they've made to the F6 here also apply to the S6. So if you watch my review video, some of the things you'll see there have changed since they've come out with the production unit. The CFast door here is slightly different. It's a little easier to use. There's a single flap here. It comes up a little higher and it's easier to stay open. The older one had two straps just like the E2, and it was a little stiffer and it doesn't come out as far, so it kind of got in the way a little bit more when you're trying to get the card in and out. There's one extra little mounting point up here. You'll see on the production unit. The buttons on the top have changed slightly. On the pre-production unit, they were rubbery just like the E2 that I had, but I believe even on the E2 now, they've updated them to these more plastic buttons. They feel a little different, and as far as I can tell, they no longer double press like they used to. Sometimes you'd go in the menu and it would jump a couple layers in when you only intended to go one, just because the buttons were double pressing. So that doesn't happen anymore. Other than that, it's essentially the same as the pre-production unit. The connections on the back haven't changed. The record button, the screen on top hasn't changed. The mounting holes on the top and the bottom haven't changed. Just a couple little changes, and they're good changes to have. Let's take a closer look at those connections on the back. There's an auxiliary 12-volt output, so if you supply power from the 12-volt LEMO input, you'll have pass-through power here, so you can use accessories like a follow focus wheel or motor or something like that. This is a 2-channel XLR input. This uses the same breakout cable as the ARRI Alexa cameras. We also have a remote port for Sony LANC control. On the other side, we have a Wi-Fi connector for use with the mobile phone app. We have an Ethernet port for streaming and controlling the camera. We have the 12-volt LEMO on the bottom, And we have a USB-C connector, which you can also use to connect your phone to the camera. And the HDMI output is on the top. One of my favorite features of these cameras is the locking EF mount. As opposed to a standard EF mount where you have a pin that's spring-loaded, this has a cinema-style ring that you rotate and it clamps down on the lens. And it even works with lenses like this Tamron 90 macro that have a rubber weather sealing ring. All you do is line up that hole on the lens with this pin, and then you rotate this ring and it clamps down. And as you can see, there's no movement between these two parts. It's very secure, and that's awesome. As opposed to every other camera that have a spring-loaded pin, they don't hold on very well. They always have a little bit of play. This has no play. Additionally, we have the electronic ND. Now, it's not available for sale just yet. This is just a clear filter. You'll be able to adjust your electronic ND in camera, and it's behind the lens, so you don't have to deal with reflections with filters in front, turning circular variable NDs, or inserting static NDs in the front. This is built in much like some of the Sony cameras like the FS7 that have built-in electronic ND. This is electronic, so it's always active. That means you'll have a little bit of a stop, like maybe one stop at all times, or maybe a little bit less than a stop. I'm not exactly sure. And then you can step it up from there. Much like Kinefinity, zcam is making available different mounts for these cameras. So right now you can order this camera in Canon EF mount or PL mount, but they've opened it up to third-party development. I would expect to see Sony E mount, that's been talked about a little bit, and if you have the S6, you'll eventually be able to order that in a Micro Four Thirds mount, which is a really interesting choice. And a user on the E2 Facebook group posted photos of this prototype Leica M mount. Really, I think the possibilities are just up to the imagination of the end users at this point. I showed this chart in my other comparison video with the Panasonic S1H. These are the frame rates and resolutions that the F6 supports. However, these numbers have been updated from a production unit, so some of the numbers have gone up, one or two of them have gone down. We gained ProRes 422 in OpenGate. Additionally, we have a new column for ZRAW. It's only been added to 2 of the modes, however. We also have a new shooting mode called Super 16. This sits right between HD and 4K. The important things to notice here are that at OpenGate, it only shoots up to 30 frames per second, and depending on your resolution and frame rate, it doesn't support all the versions of ProRes. H.265 supports all of the highest frame rates and resolutions. And lastly, in these modes, it'll crop in at frame rates above 48 or 50, and there's a user-selectable crop below that. Expect zcam to continually update these numbers as they find new ways to squeeze out more resolutions and frame rates from this sensor. When viewed like this, you can see just how many different resolutions it supports, from OpenGate to 6K modes to some 5K modes, 4K modes, and of course HD. There's a lot of flexibility here. This is 6K OpenGate, which means it's using the entire size of the sensor, and like I just mentioned, it only supports up to 30 frames per second. Now, this is actually a sensor limitation. It's not due to processing or media. It has a 3:2 ratio, which would actually make this pretty good for anamorphic shooting. Cinema 6K uses the full width of the sensor. It just brings down the top and bottom to a 17:9 ratio. 6K isn't quite as wide as Cinema 6K, but it is slightly taller. It seems like there's not quite a consensus on what 6K resolution should be. In the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, it's a different resolution. The S6 and the F6 do have the same 6K resolution, so that at least there's a consistency among the brand. In Cinema 6K 2.4:1, again, you have the full width of the sensor, and it just crops down on the top and bottom a bit more to give you that wider aspect ratio. The benefit here is that you get 60 frames per second. In 5K 4:3, you get the full vertical height of the sensor like you do in OpenGate. It crops in on the left and right sides. It also tops out at 30 frames per second like OpenGate does, so you might ask, why would I want to shoot in this mode? And that's a really good question. Honestly, I'm not sure. The file sizes will be a little bit smaller, but not really an appreciable difference, so I think zcam needs to maybe up the frame rate on this if they can. And the same goes for 5K 6:5 ratio. In Cinema 4K, we enjoy the entire width of the sensor being downscaled to 4K until you reach 48 frames per second. It then gives you a windowed crop. The benefit in shooting one of the 4K modes over the 6K modes is your file sizes will be smaller, but then you don't have the option of choosing what part of that 6K image you want to crop in on. You also don't control the scaling. There are different methods of scaling. Some look better than others, and you're stuck with whatever zcam is doing. It looks good to me. I'm just saying there are some people who are more picky about these kind of things. The 4K field of view is slightly narrower, but a little bit taller. The benefit here is that it only crops in at 50 frames and above, but that's just a minor difference. Cinema 4K 2.4:1 gives you some really high frame rates, but it's always cropped in, so that field of view is much smaller. Because of that, presumably, you get the option of ZRAW. This is only one of 2 modes that has that option. And Super 16 is a brand new mode. I haven't even shot with it here. I'm just simulating what it would look like. It's a little bit larger than HD, and I guarantee it's in here because users were asking for it, and zcam delivered. Unfortunately, it's cropped, and this is a big crop, so I'm sure they could give us something like 100 frames per second without cropping in, since HD does it up to 120 frames per second. But right now, it's just a crop. We do get the highest frame rate the camera provides, 170 frames per second. And you also have the option of ZRAW. And good old HD is bringing up the rear. The good news is it supports 120 frames in all of the different codecs. And it's scaled down, not cropped, so you're getting the benefits of that large sensor. Congratulations for making it through all of the frame rates and resolutions. I know it's a lot to take in. Let me break it down the way I think about it. All of the 6K and 5K modes are using a large part of the sensor. They're not cropping in. Your max frame rates are 30, 48, and 60. Cinema 4K and 4K crop above 48 and 50 frames respectively. They top out at 72 frames per second. Cinema 4K 2.4:1 and Super 16 are always cropped, but they have the highest frame rates and they give you ZRAW. And HD is never cropped. There are always more things I could talk about with this camera. There's more features in the menu. There's the whole phone app on both Android and iOS that is really nice for controlling the camera, monitoring, and viewing playback. But this video is already pushing 30 minutes, and I've touched on some of those things in some of my other videos, and the menu system is mostly the same among all of the E2 cameras. I chose this camera as my main camera because I know it's going to give me the best image quality that I can afford. At $5,000, it's still fairly expensive, but we're getting very impressive specs and definitely some good image quality. You can buy, the Blackmagic 6K, the Panasonic S1H, and they are both good cameras, but they don't give you quite as much in the area of resolution and frame rates that the zcam does. And if you're shooting 6K in the Blackmagic, you have to deal with BRAW, which people seem to love, but there's also a number of issues with it right now just because it's a new format and it's not supported very well in all the different NLEs. The S1H, the biggest problem with that one is that it doesn't output video if you're recording over 4K, which is a really silly limitation. It has really good image quality. It has IBIS built in. It's pretty great. But for me, the choice is zcam. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of it has to do with the company. They are actively listening to their users. They are interacting every day on the Facebook group, and countless number of suggestions by users have made their way into these cameras, and it's just a really interesting interplay between customer and company that I don't see with any other brand. Panasonic's way too big. They only listen to the biggest influencers out there. Blackmagic has a lot of users. They can't listen to all of them. They are obviously influenced by their end users, but their cameras are cheaply made by comparison. Those Blackmagic cameras with the composite body, they're prone to having a number of issues, breaking easily. So the zcam, I've never had it break on me. I've never had it really fail, especially not when I was recording. So it's been a very excellent and reliable camera. Thanks for hanging in to the end. My next video is going to be another cosplay music video. This one's holiday themed, so I hope to have that out before Christmas. Please hit that like and subscribe button, hit that little notification bell if you want to be notified when I post my next video. I'm working on a video for the Portkeys BM5 Mark II monitor with the Bluetooth module. I'm going to be testing it with a number of different cameras. That's going to be interesting, so I'll see you then.